Tears in Munich. A historic moment unfolds as Christoph Eusgen, the president of the Munich Security Conference, breaks down his disappointment with America's new stance written all over his face. But why? What changed? And why is the world suddenly shifting beneath Europe's feet? For decades, Europe believed it had a secure place under America's protective umbrella. But today, a chilling message echoes across the old continent. It's a statement that carries the weight of a geopolitical earthquake, a message signed by the Russian bear and the rising Asian dragon, a power shift that has shaken NATO to its core and left Europe scrambling for answers. Behind closed doors, a seismic deal is taking shape, a whispered agreement between the United States and Russia that could alter the course of history. The reported terms of this deal include the U.S. formally recognizing Crimea as Russian territory, the Donbas region gaining autonomy under Russian influence, a phased withdrawal of Russian troops, NATO expansion in Eastern Europe being frozen, a gradual removal of sanctions on Russia, a significant reduction in U.S. military aid to Ukraine, a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. It's a deal that favors Moscow, isolates Kiev, and leaves Europe powerless, a deal that many in the West are calling America's betrayal. Europe is waking up to a new reality, one where Washington no longer guarantees its security. The result? Chaos, economic hardship, and a desperate search for alternatives. But how? The European economy is slowing, energy supplies are dwindling, and now NATO is divided like never before. For the first time in history, NATO forces are holding drills without America, a test of survival in a world where Washington has turned its back.
As usual, Trump did not stop there. He escalated the pressure on the Europeans and increased tariffs, reminding them of his firm stance. No protection without compensation, and NATO members must pay. The blonde old man did not stop at threats but hinted at leaving the alliance entirely, a move that could be a geopolitical earthquake changing the global balance of power. What perhaps best expresses that difficult phase is that unusual scene when the Munich Security Conference chairman could not contain himself. 8. Christoph Eusgen himself shed tears, expressing his deep disappointment with America's recent positions regarding its European allies. The reason was the speech of the American vice president, who explicitly stated that he was for negotiation and that Ukraine must accept the conditions of Russian annexation, otherwise he would stop military support and leave the field open to Russia. It seems that Europe received a strong slap in the face regarding the American-Russian rapprochement, as expressed by the editorial of The Economist magazine titled Europe's Nightmare, where Trump and Putin appeared sitting against a red backdrop, while the empty seats suggest NATO's absence from the scene. The message is clear. Europe feels the Western alliance is faltering, but The Economist did not stop at diagnosis and proposed a bold solution, which is, despite its sluggish economy, Europe is still a massive force capable of standing up to Moscow. Instead of waiting for Washington, it should utilize the frozen Russian funds amounting to 210 billion euros to support Ukraine and rearm. The most provocative suggestion was raising the European military accord to 4 or 5% of the GDP, which brings Europe back to Cold War levels. But there is a fundamental problem. Where will this money come from? According to calculations, achieving this goal requires $300 billion annually, which means massive debts and deficits in European budgets that are already under economic pressure. Here emerges the vision of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who used to say, Europe represents 7% of the world's population, but it possesses 25% of the global economy and bears 50% of global social spending. This equation is no longer sustainable. If Europe wants to face the challenges of the new world, it must reduce the welfare of its citizens in favor of enhancing its security. A new end. You did what I commanded you. Okay, but my reconciliation comes first. This is how he declared
The cousin
it.
Sammy and the virtuous
Here
modesty.
in the old continent, after they followed their instructions and confronted the Russian bear to appease Washington. When the Ukrainian crisis erupted, Europe rushed to impose harsh sanctions on Russia, driven by American pressure. Yes, the old continent bet on unconditional American support, but Washington, as usual, played for its interests first. And now it is beginning to rearrange its cards with Russia and China, leaving Europe is united in facing the consequences of its hostility towards Russia. And now, after France has realized that relying on America is no longer
option. The president
French
began.
President Emmanuel
Translate.
Macron spoke clumsily about creating a new European alliance free from American influence, in order to achieve the dream that France has always aspired to, which is leading Europe in the absence of the United States, in a desperate attempt to regain some of the European decision-making independence that was lost under the weight of dependency on Washington. At the same time, it seemed the old continent is facing major economic challenges, especially in the energy sector, where a harsh winter looms on the horizon with declining gas reserves and rising financing costs. For the coming years, Europe tries to reassess its defense and economic strategy. It seems that the European-American alliance is going through an unprecedented turmoil that may ultimately lead to the reshaping of the European security system away from American influence. And today, the Ukrainian warship sails against what Europeans desire. The surrender deal is absolutely ineligible, and it may end up in a third world war. With these words, the blonde old man Donald Trump shocked Kyiv and its European allies as he described his opinion of Zelensky, not just a description, but it is. And the new American approach to ending the Ukrainian war in a way that satisfies the ambitions of Russian Tsar Putin. In a surprising move that sparked global controversy, U.S. President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir, an agreement was reached to end the Ukrainian war, which included bold provisions granting Moscow official American recognition of its sovereignty over Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, and expanded autonomy for the Donbas regions, in exchange for the gradual withdrawal of Russian forces and the freezing of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. The agreement also stipulated the gradual lifting of sanctions. The economic sanctions imposed on Russia, the reduction of American military support for Ukraine, and above all, providing guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO, along with enhancing economic and diplomatic cooperation between Moscow and Washington. Despite the Russian welcome of the deal, it was met with rejection. Ukraine was shocked, considering it a betrayal by America of its interests, as it was excluded from the negotiations by an American hand to appease the enemy of yesterday and friend of today, Emperor Vladimir Putin. Yes, it seems that the terms of that deal were not surprising to the West, which perceived the American-Russian rapprochement, excluding Europe, as a reflection of Trump's approach. He decided to abandon Europe and before it Ukraine, viewing them as economically wasteful. Putin had announced it previously.
He said, I can take you.
The entire Ukrainian land that I want whenever I wish. And it seems it was not just a promise or a warning, as today Trump declared, saying Putin does not have to sit at the negotiating table. He can swallow Ukraine whole if he wants.
The Zarik while you sit.
Ukraine and its European allies are caught between a rock and a hard place amidst severe concern over this rapprochement, which shatters all their political, military, and even economic hopes and ambitions. So what will happen if the American-Russian rapprochement succeeds, and what are its implications for Europe and called all Europeans? Let me tell you, my dear, that if the Russian-American rapprochement succeeds and the two sides officially agree on the terms of the anticipated deal through which they will share influence, in Europe and the Middle East, the result will be catastrophic for Europe, akin to a devastating hurricane that could uproot the trees of the old continent. Europe has always relied on the United States to confront Russian threats, whether through NATO expansion or imposing sanctions. Economic. But in light of signs of rapprochement, European capitals Occidentals will find themselves facing a new reality that requires them to either enhance their strategic independence, the direction and increase of its military spending, or the search for a new understanding with Moscow to protect its economic interests, especially in the field of energy. As for Ukraine, it could be the biggest loser in this equation, as it relied on Western support in its resilience against Russia, whether through military aid or the sanctions imposed on Moscow. But if Washington's priorities change and it prefers, if it tries to reach a deal with Moscow, Kiev might find itself forced to make painful concessions that could include accepting Moscow's control over the Crimean Peninsula and making concessions in Donbass, which could lead to a reshaping of its political and geographical future. This rapprochement between the two superpowers might not, it may be just a temporary step, but it might indicate a new global direction where the United States seeks to focus on confronting China as a main strategic competitor, while Russia tries to support from its influence in Eastern Europe without entering into direct conflict with the West. Amid these changes, Europe may find itself compelled to build its independent security system away from American dominance, while Ukraine anxiously awaits its destiny amid a complex political game that it confronted. Now, the question for you, our viewers, is: can this rapprochement lead lead to global stability, or is it just a calm before the storm?